Imagine the Sahara 1942. The sun burns white against endless dunes. A German officer lowers his binoculars, his face frozen in disbelief. Before him, charging through waves of heat and sand, are soldiers he never expected to face. African troops, moving with precision and fury that will shatter his entire conception of this war. This is not the story you were taught. For decades, the narrative of North Africa belonged to Rommel, Montgomery, and white Allied heroes. But the truth, buried in dusty archives and forgotten graves, tells a different tale. The men who truly broke the German war machine in the desert were written out of history, not because they failed, but because acknowledging their triumph would have destroyed the very foundations of colonial power. This is their story, the recruitment. In 1939, as Europe descended into war, a quiet mobilization began across French and British colonial Africa. From Senegal to Kenya, from Nigeria to Madagascar, colonial administrators arrived in villages with promises that would echo for generations. Fight for the empire, they said. Return as equals. Earn your freedom through service. The words were carefully chosen. For young men living under the boot of colonialism, the proposition seemed impossible to refuse. Some volunteered for adventure, others for escape from poverty. Many believed, genuinely believed, that proving their courage on European battlefields would finally earn their people respect, citizenship, rights. In the villages of French West Africa, recruiters signed up the Tirailleurs Sénégalais, a name that concealed their true diversity. These weren't just Senegalese soldiers. They came from across the Sahel. Bambara warriors from Mali, Wolof fishermen from coastal Senegal, Mossi farmers from Burkina Faso. The British recruited from their own territories. The King's African Rifles drew from Uganda, Kenya, and Tanganyika. Nigerian regiments formed with Hausa, Yoruba, and Igbo men. By 1940, hundreds of thousands of African soldiers had been mobilized. Their training was brutal, conducted in the same landscapes they would soon fight in. Deserts, mountains, unforgiving heat. But they received inferior equipment, outdated rifles, and the constant disdain of European officers who viewed them as cannon fodder, nothing more. The threat. Meanwhile, in North Africa, a legend was being born. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, arrived in Libya in February 1941 with his Africa Corps. Within weeks, he had pushed British forces back across hundreds of miles, capturing Benghazi and laying siege to Tobruk. His tanks roared across the desert with mechanical precision. His tactical genius became the stuff of nightmares for Allied command. By mid-1942, Rommel stood at the gates of Egypt. Behind him lay a trail of defeated British divisions. Before him stretched the road to the Suez Canal, to Middle Eastern oil fields, to a strategic victory that could change the entire course of the war. Someone had to stop him. The British High Command scrambled. Churchill demanded action. Plans were drawn and redrawn. But in the desperate calculus of war, a quiet decision was made, one that would be systematically erased from the history books. Deploy the African regiments, Acte 2, into the desert, minutes 8 to 20. The invisible warriors, they arrived in Libya and Egypt by the thousands. These soldiers from tropical forests and grasslands, stepping into an alien world of sand and stone. European officers watched them with skepticism. German intelligence barely noted their presence. Everyone underestimated them. That was their first advantage. Private Alhaji Grunshi of the Gold Coast Regiment wrote in his diary, "The desert is like nothing we knew, but the Europeans, they suffer more than us. They complain of heat we find bearable. They struggle with thirst we have learned to endure. The land may be foreign, but we adapt as we always have." The African troops brought something unexpected to the North African campaign: environmental resilience. While European soldiers wilted under the Mediterranean sun, requiring massive water supplies and struggling with desert conditions, many African soldiers, particularly those from Sahel regions, found the climate demanding but manageable. They could march longer distances with less water. They read the terrain with instincts honed by generations. But adaptation alone wouldn't win battles. First blood. The initial engagements came against Italian forces in 1940 and early 1941. In Eritrea, at the Battle of Keren, the momentum shifted dramatically when African and Indian troops of the British Commonwealth forces launched a brutal mountain assault. The fighting lasted 53 days, some of the most intense mountain warfare of the entire war. French tirailleurs fighting for free France after refusing to surrender with Vichy forces proved equally formidable. At the Battle of Bir Hakeim in June 1942, a mixed force, including African soldiers, held a desert fortress against overwhelming German and Italian attacks for 16 days. Rommel himself called it a delay that cost him his chance at Egypt. Colonel Pierre Koenig, commanding at Bir Hakeim, later wrote, "The tirailleurs fought with a determination that bordered on the supernatural. They held positions that should have fallen in hours for day after day, asking only for ammunition and water. Within the ranks, something remarkable was happening. These regiments brought together men who spoke dozens of languages, practiced different religions, came from rival ethnic groups that had warred for centuries. Bambara soldiers fought beside Fulani. Muslim tirailleurs shared foxholes with Christian King's African rifles. The colonial structure that had divided them in peace was, ironically, forging them into brotherhood in war." A French officer observed, "They created their own lingua franca, their own codes of honor. They didn't fight for France or Britain. They fought for each other and for some vision of respect they hoped to earn." The German realization. By mid-1942, Wehrmacht intelligence reports began to change. Where African troops had once been dismissed in a single line, now entire paragraphs analyzed their capabilities. One captured German document noted, "The colored colonial troops display unexpected discipline under fire. Their night fighting abilities are superior to expectations. Underestimating these units has proven costly." But the systematic racism of Nazi ideology made it nearly impossible for German command to fully internalize this reality. Hitler's racial theories promised that non-Aryan troops would crumble before German might. Rommel, more pragmatic than his Führer, began to suspect otherwise. But by then, it was too late to adjust. The stage was set for the decisive confrontation. Act 3, the desert battles against the Germans, minutes 20 to 35. El Alamein, the turning point, October 23, 1942. The desert night explodes with the thunder of 1,000 guns. The Second Battle of El Alamein had begun, the battle that would become the turning point of the North African campaign. History would remember it as Montgomery's victory. But buried in the official accounts, hidden in regimental records, is another truth. African troops were at the heart of the breakthrough. The 4th Indian Division, which included several East African battalions, led the initial assault through the German minefields. Under withering machine gun fire, they cleared corridors for tanks, suffering devastating casualties. When European battalions faltered, African regiments pushed forward. Captain John Nunnally of the British Army later recalled, "I watched Nigerian troops advance under fire that should have broken any force. They moved with discipline and courage that shamed some of our veteran British units. When we finally broke through, it was largely because they refused to stop. The fighting was hellish. In the darkness, between the minefields and barbed wire, soldiers fought hand to hand. The Germans had fortified every position, believing their defensive lines impregnable. But night after night, African troops infiltrated, attacked, held ground that others couldn't take." Private Sammy Cordy from the Gold Coast wrote to his family, "We fight not just the Germans, but the desert itself. Sand in our weapons, heat that makes steel too hot to touch, thirst that drives men mad. But we do not break. We cannot break. Too much depends on us." Keren and the mountain war before El Alamein, there was Keren, a battle largely forgotten in popular history, but studied in military academies for its tactical brilliance. In February 1941, Italian forces held the mountain passes of Keren in Eritrea, blocking the Allied advance into East Africa. The position was considered nearly impregnable. Sheer cliffs, fortified bunkers, artillery positions with clear fields of fire. The assault fell largely to the 4th and 5th Indian Divisions, including the King's African Rifles and other East African units. What followed was 7 weeks of mountain warfare so intense that veterans compared it to World War I's worst battles. The African soldiers, many from highland regions of Kenya and Uganda, excelled in the vertical warfare. They climbed cliffs Italian defenders thought impassable. They attacked at night using terrain knowledge and stealth that European training had never taught them. Sergeant Negasi Abera, an Ethiopian who fought with the King's African Rifles, recounted, "The Italians looked down on us from their mountains. They did not know we had climbed higher mountains to hunt, to herd, to live. When we came in the darkness, they panicked. Their fortress became their trap. The breakthrough at Keren opened East Africa. It shattered Italian colonial power. And it proved decisively that African soldiers weren't just competent, they were elite. The human cost behind every tactical victory lay staggering sacrifice. At El Alamein alone, African casualties numbered in the thousands. Bodies fell in the minefields and weren't recovered for weeks. Men died of wounds in field hospitals that treated them as afterthoughts. The supply chains that kept European soldiers equipped somehow failed to deliver proper boots, medical supplies, or even adequate food to African units. Yet they continued to fight. A French officer wrote with guilt-tinged admiration, "The tirailleurs accepted privations that would have caused mutiny in any French regiment. They endured racism from their own officers while dying for a nation that had enslaved their grandparents." I do not understand their motivation, but I witness it daily and it humbles me. The strategic collapse. After El Alamein, the German retreat began. Rommel, his supply lines cut and his forces depleted, withdrew westward. The myth of the invincible Afrika Korps shattered against the reality of soldiers who refused to be defeated. German commanders had made a fatal miscalculation. Their entire strategy assumed that colonial troops would be inferior, poorly trained, poorly motivated, easily broken. When this assumption proved false, they had no contingency. A captured Wehrmacht officer, interrogated after the battle, admitted, "We were told these troops would not stand and fight. We were told they lacked discipline and courage. We were catastrophically wrong." By May 1943, when Axis forces in North Africa finally surrendered, African soldiers had participated in every major engagement. They had fought from Sudan to Tunisia, from the mountains of Eritrea to the beaches of Libya. They had suffered disproportionate casualties and received disproportionately little recognition, but they had won. The question remained, what would victory cost them? Act 4, Victory Without Glory, minutes 35 to 45. The reckoning that never came. When the guns finally fell silent across North Africa, when the last German prisoners marched into captivity, the African soldiers waited for the promises to be fulfilled. They waited to go home as heroes. They waited for the pay they'd been guaranteed. They waited for the citizenship, the rights, the equality they'd been promised in exchange for their blood. They waited in vain. Tirailleurs. The Massacre of Heroes. December 1st, 1944. Tirailleurs, Senegal. Approximately 1,600 tirailleurs Senegalais, recently returned from German POW camps in the battlefields of Europe, were stationed at a transit camp outside Dakar. They had fought for France. They had endured years of captivity. Now they demanded something simple, the pay and benefits they'd been promised. The French colonial authorities refused. Negotiations broke down. Tensions escalated. And then on the morning of December 1st, French troops surrounded the camp. What happened next remains partially obscured by official lies and destroyed records. But the truth has emerged through survivor testimony and recent historical investigation. French forces opened fire on unarmed African soldiers. The official death toll was listed as 35. Survivors and historians believe the actual number was over 300. The wounded were denied medical treatment. Leaders of the mutiny were court-martialed and imprisoned. The French government classified documents about Tirailleurs for decades. Tirailleurs wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symbol of betrayal that occurred across colonial Africa. Broken promises across the continent. In British territories, African veterans faced similar injustices, though rarely as overtly violent as Tirailleurs. East African soldiers who had fought from Addis Ababa to Burma were demobilized with minimal compensation. The pensions promised to British Commonwealth troops somehow didn't apply equally to African soldiers. When they asked why, they were told their service had been adequately compensated by their employment during the war. In Gold Coast, now Ghana, Nigerian, and Kenyan communities, veterans returned to find themselves treated not as heroes, but as potential troublemakers. Colonial authorities feared that soldiers who had seen the world, who had fought alongside Europeans as equals, would demand political rights. They were correct to fear this. But rather than honor the veterans, the colonial governments chose suppression. Secret memos circulated among British officials warning against allowing African veterans to organize or speak publicly about their wartime experiences. African soldiers were excluded from official victory parades in London and Paris. When monuments were built, their regiments were omitted or relegated to footnotes. Personal stories of erasure. Corporal Ousmane Ndiaye returned to his village in Senegal in 1946. He had fought at Bir Hakeim and El Alamein. He had earned medals that French officers grudgingly pinned to his uniform. He expected to build a new life with his military pension. The pension never came. He died in 1978 in poverty, his medals sold decades earlier to feed his family. His children never saw his name in a history book. The French army had no record of his service. Thousands of stories echoed his. Private James Mwangi of the King's African Rifles fought from Ethiopia to Burma. He returned to Kenya expecting the British to honor their promise of land grants for veterans. Instead, he watched as white settlers in Kenya received preferential treatment for military service, while African veterans were told no land was available. He joined the independence movement. The British labeled him a terrorist. Across the continent, the pattern repeated. African veterans became dangerous to colonial power, not because of what they might do, but because of what they represented. Proof that the colonial lie that Africans were inferior, incapable of courage, discipline, or sophisticated military action was utterly false. The systematic cover-up. In archives from Paris to London, the documentary record was carefully curated. Official military histories of North Africa mentioned African troops in passing, if at all. Rommel remained the star, Montgomery the hero, and the grinding detail of who actually broke through at El Alamein, who held Bir Hakeim, who climbed the cliffs at Keren, that detail was allowed to fade into obscurity. Film footage existed showing African soldiers in combat, in victory parades, receiving commendations. Much of it was locked away or destroyed. When war films were made in the 1950s and 60s, African soldiers were simply written out of the scripts. A French historian who tried to publish a comprehensive account of the tirailleurs in the 1960s found his work blocked by government censorship. The official reason, protecting national unity. The real reason, protecting the colonial narrative. Why the erasure? The answer is as cynical as it is obvious. Acknowledging the decisive role of African soldiers in defeating Germany would have undermined the entire colonial project. If Africans could fight as well as Europeans, if they could outperform Europeans in courage, discipline, and tactical ability, then what justification remained for colonial rule? The myth of European superiority was essential to maintaining empires across Africa. Soldiers who had proven themselves equal to or better than their colonizers represented an existential threat to that myth. So they were erased. Not immediately, not dramatically, but systematically. A name removed from a medal list here, a photograph excluded from an exhibition there, a regimental history quietly taken out of print. Within a generation, the memory had faded from public consciousness. The veterans grew old and died, many in poverty, their stories told only to children and grandchildren who themselves were told that such tales were exaggerations or fantasies. But the documentary evidence remained, buried but not destroyed, and eventually someone would go looking for it. ACT 5, The Reckoning and Legacy, minutes 45 to 50. The slow resurrection of memory. For decades, the story remained hidden, but history has a way of refusing to stay buried. In the 1990s, as African nations celebrated decades of independence, a new generation of historians began asking uncomfortable questions. They dug through colonial archives, interviewed the last surviving veterans, cross-referenced military records that had been scattered across continents. What they found stunned them. Professor Anthony Clayton's work on East African forces in World War II revealed the massive scale of African military contribution, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, critical battles, decisive victories. French historian Julien Fargatas meticulously documented the tirailleurs, uncovering evidence of Thyroid and other suppressions. Kenyan and Nigerian scholars trace their own nation's veterans, finding patterns of betrayal and erasure. The work continues. Recently declassified documents show even more clearly the deliberate nature of the erasure. Memos between colonial officials discussing how to minimize African contributions in official histories. Instructions to film companies about appropriate ways to depict the war. Pension records showing systematic denial of benefits. Descendants fighting for recognition. Today, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of these soldiers are fighting for their memory. In Senegal, activists successfully lobbied for proper memorials to the tirailleurs. In 2006, France finally agreed to equalize the pensions of surviving African veterans, a gesture that came 60 years too late for most, but still meant everything to the few who remained. In Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, oral history projects have recorded the testimonies of the last veterans of the King's African Rifles. Their stories are now taught in schools, slowly rewriting the national understanding of World War II. In 2019, France officially recognized the massacre at Thiaroye, though details remain contested and full accountability has not been achieved. The acknowledgement, however incomplete, marked a turning point. Rewriting the North African campaign, military historians are now reassessing the entire North African campaign through a more honest lens. We now understand that El Alamein was won not just by Montgomery's planning, but by the brutal sacrifice of Commonwealth troops, including African soldiers, who did the actual breaking through. We recognize that Bir Hakim's defense, which delayed Rommel's advance at a critical moment, depended heavily on African tirailleurs. We acknowledge that the East African campaign succeeded because of African soldiers' mountain warfare expertise. This isn't political correctness or revisionism. It's history corrected by evidence, and it changes how we understand World War II itself. The good war narrative of European democracies defeating fascism becomes more complicated when we acknowledge that those democracies were simultaneously maintaining brutal colonial systems. The soldiers who defeated Nazi racism were themselves victims of French and British racism. That paradox demands reflection. The moral weight of forgotten heroes, these men changed the course of history. Their courage helped defeat an ideology of racial supremacy. Their sacrifice protected nations that had colonized them. And they were forgotten, not through accident, not through the natural fading of memory, but through deliberate choice, through policies and decisions made by governments that feared the implications of acknowledging African equality. When we tell the story of World War II without including them, we participate in that erasure. When we watch films about North Africa that show only white soldiers, we reinforce that lie. When we teach history that ignores their contribution, we continue the injustice. The call to remember today, scattered across Africa, a few dozen elderly men remain, the last living veterans of these campaigns. They are in their 90s and hundreds, their memories fragile, their time running short. Some have finally received recognition, others died waiting for it. But their story, the full, true story, is finally being told. In books and documentaries, in academic papers and public memorials, in the oral histories passed down through families, the truth is emerging. These men deserve more than belated recognition. They deserve to be central to how we understand the war that shaped the modern world. They deserve to be taught alongside Montgomery and Patton, remembered alongside Churchill and Roosevelt. They defeated the Germans in the desert. They changed history, and they were written out of it. We cannot undo that injustice, but we can refuse to perpetuate it. Final reflection. Imagine that German officer again, lowering his binoculars in the Saharan heat, watching soldiers he never expected to face, advancing with discipline and fury that will break his lines. Imagine the French administrator at Thiaroye, giving the order to fire on men who had fought for France. Imagine the bureaucrat in London, striking African names from the honors list. Imagine the old veteran in a Senegalese village, holding medals he will have to sell to survive, knowing history will forget him. These moments are connected. They tell one story about courage, betrayal, and the deliberate erasure of inconvenient truth. But they tell another story too, about resilience, about how truth, however deeply buried, eventually emerges, about how descendants refuse to let their ancestors be forgotten, about how history, properly told, can be an act of justice. The African soldiers who defeated the Germans in the desert were forgotten by design, but they are forgotten no longer. Their story has been reclaimed, their sacrifice recognized, their place in history restored, not because governments decided to honor them, but because people, historians, activists, descendants, truth seekers, refused to let the lie stand. This is their memorial, the truth finally told. Remember their names. Remember their sacrifice. Remember that when we are taught history, we must always ask, who is missing from this story and why? The answers change everything.